If I stand here, I'll block your view, right?
Okay, so okay, we're gonna do it. You ready to start?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah. Two khashuv chairs this time.
So, not at all. No, I don't mind. I want you to be able to see.
You wanna light the candle? Yeah, why not? Okay. Hi everyone. Welcome to sorry. I put mine on silent too. Okay, welcome to Zokaron Salon. We have the honor of having Francis Morton with us here to tell the story of his parents, who both were survivors from the Holocaust. Just before we hear the story, we'll start with the memorial prayer for all the people perished in the Holocaust, and we'll light a Ner Neshama, a candle, and then we'll hear the stories. So we'll please just all stand up for the memorial prayer. I'll cite it in Hebrew, and then we'll light the candle. אל מלא רחמים שוכן במרומים, אמצא מנוחה נכונה על כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים את כל הנשמות של 6 מיליוני היהודים חללי השואה באירופה שנהרגו, שנשחטו, שנשרפו ושנספו על קידוש השם על ידי המרצחים הגרמנים הנאצים יימח שמם ועוזריהם משאר העמים, בעבור שכל הקהל מתפלל על לעילוי נשמותיהם, לכן בעל הרחמים יסתירם מסדר כנפיו לעולמים ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם, אדוני הוא נחלתם, וגן עדן תהיה מנוחתם, ויעמדו לגורלם לקץ הימין, ונאמר אמן.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to my talk entitled Letters of Love and Loss. Now, before I begin, I should make just a couple of points. Where extracts of some of these letters are voiced, I've had to use actors because sadly the original writers of these letters are no longer with us. The other thing to bear in mind is that most of the audiences who I speak to about this are fairly ignorant about the Shoah, about the Holocaust, and about Jews generally. So some of this may appear a bit simple as far as you're concerned. Anyway, with that said, it's funny, isn't it, what you sometimes find in an old shoebox? I came across one a bit like this several years ago after my mother had died. And the contents of that shoebox sent me on a long journey, and I found out far more about my family than I ever knew when they were alive. So let me begin with the purpose of my talk. Well, firstly, and most importantly, is to try to comprehend what the murder of an estimated 6 million Jews during the Second World War really meant. Because I don't know about you, but I can't really get my mind around that number. Just too great. So I'd like to narrow it down to the effect on just a few people, members of my own family, in fact. And the secondary purpose is to seek to gain your empathy with, your sympathy for the plight of refugees and their families, forced to travel a long way away, to leave their homes, start all over again in a foreign country, maybe in a foreign language. My parents both came from what was Czechoslovakia until fairly recently. And to be honest, I'll carry on referring it to that, even though it's now been split into Czech Republic and Slovakia. That's a yellow country in the middle of Europe, a long way away from Great Britain, and very near to Germany in the brown and Austria in the blue. Now, at that time, there were living in Czechoslovakia about 3.2 million ethnic Germans. That's about 20% of the population. Mostly, they lived in the west of the country, the bit nearest to Germany, in what's known as the Sudetenland. And by way of comparison with that 3.2 million ethnic Germans, there are also some 360,000 Jews living in the country as well. Now, when I was growing up in London in the 1950s, I had a very small family. My two parents, George and Renée, my older brother Philip, and myself, and that was it. And sometimes as a child, I'd ask my mother, how come I don't have grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, like most of my friends? My mother brushed that question aside and simply said, oh, they died in the war, in a way that clearly I was not meant to ask more about. And now I'd like to introduce you to my mother, Renée. This is a picture of her, about the sort of age that I am today, living in North London, in Finchley to be precise. And this is a picture of her as a young girl, living with her family in a large flat in central Prague. And in this picture, she's sitting next to her father, who's got a protective arm around her, and she's stroking a cat. And this, for me, sums up what I imagine her youth to be like, surrounded by a loving family. She had an older sister, Ilse, some 4 years older. That's Ilse on the left with her husband, Peter Keane, who was a very talented, up-and-coming young artist. And in fact, I don't know if any of you have come across the opera, the Kaiser von Atlantis, the Emperor of Atlantis, but he wrote the libretto to that while in Terezin. My grandparents, Renée's parents, my grandfather Karl, who worked for a bank in central Prague, my grandmother Marta, sophisticated and elegant, stayed at home. They were a Jewish family, but not strongly religious. And so I was surprised when I came across one story fairly recently about my grandfather. You see, as a young man, he studied at the University of Vienna, and he got his first degree. He carried on and studied further and got a second degree, at which point he was offered a very prestigious job at the university on one condition. That was, he gave up being Jewish, he converted to Catholicism. Now, despite not being strongly religious, this was something he was just not prepared to do, and his career followed a very different path. And for me, that also says something about the Central Europe, that even in those days, and we're talking well before the Second World War, anti-Semitism was around, because why else would you ask someone to change their religion in order to get a job? Living with a family in Prague was Marta's widowed mother, Clara. And I believe she's one reason why the family didn't attempt to get out until it was too late, was because of Clara. You see, they didn't want to leave her alone while they saved themselves. At the same time, they didn't want her to have to uproot and start all over again when she was already in her 80s. And so my grandparents stayed. One person, however, who did get away was Renée's uncle Robert, Marta's younger brother, who made his way through occupied France, Spain, and got a ship in Portugal, and eventually made his way to the US. And this summarizes the family tree so far. And you'll see in the middle, there's a question mark where there should be a picture of Marta and Robert's older sister, Erna. You see, she was living in Prague during the war as well. And at one point, she just vanished. And even her son, who did survive the war, didn't manage to find anything at all about what happened to her. She was just airbrushed out. But I did come across this photograph taken quite a few years earlier. Here you'll see Renée's grandmother Clara on the right and grandfather Sigmund on the left. That woman is my grandmother Marta, somewhat younger than in previous photographs. And there in the middle is the only record that I have of Great Aunt Erna. And I like this photograph as well. It shows what looks like a family tea. There's some used cups and saucers on the table and some interesting looking cakes that haven't yet been consumed. And this all sums up a nice, comfortable existence. But just over the border in Germany, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party took power in Germany in 1933 and immediately set about bringing more and more anti-Jewish laws and other measures, until by the end of the war there were over 2,000 such. Now these included, in 1933, public burning of books written by Jews and other anti-Nazis, and Germans were told they shouldn't shop in Jewish businesses. In 1934, Jewish students were barred from taking exams. Now what that meant is that even though they might have been studying for years to become doctors or dentists and so on, because they hadn't taken their final exams, they couldn't pass, and therefore they couldn't qualify to work in those fields. In 1935, the so-called Nuremberg laws were brought in, which denied citizenship rights to Jews in Germany, including, but not restricted to, marriage between Jews and non-Jews. A year later, Jews were banned from all public parks, restaurants, swimming pools, and so on. And in 1938, all Jewish children were barred from going to German schools. Now, at the same time, Hitler was threatening to take over the Sudetenland. He said it belonged to Germany and they wanted it back. Now, in fact, it had never been part of Germany, but that didn't stop him demanding it more and more menacingly. So my grandparents decided the best thing they could do would be to send their young daughter to somewhere much safer. And they found a family in Cambridge, in England, who they barely knew, but who agreed to take my mother in as a domestic servant. That meant doing housework, cleaning, washing, childcare, and so on. And to be absolutely honest, I would imagine my mother was fairly hopeless at that. You see, she'd never done anything like that in her life. She'd been interested in studying, in reading, in music, and generally getting ready to go to university. But there was no choice. Britain at that time was not very welcoming to refugees from Europe, but they did make available some 28,000 domestic service visas, and each one of those visas saved someone's life. And this attitude towards refugees is around today as well. I was actually shocked when, nearly 10 years ago, Britain's Prime Minister then, David Cameron, spoke about migrants swarming to Britain. Because you see, once you start talking about people as swarms, you're dehumanizing them. You don't see them as people in need, just as pests to be discouraged. And that attitude was also around at that time as well, talking about German Jews pouring into this country. Now, when my mother came to England, she left behind family and friends, most of whom she never ever saw again. One of the people she left behind was this young man, Jerzy Morgenstern. But I'll come back to his story later on. And coming back to that old shoebox, when I'd had a chance to go through it, I found it contained some 500 or so letters written to my mother between about 1938 and 1946. Now, half the letters were written in German, and of the rest, about half were written in Czech, so it took me some time to get them translated. But when I did, it gave me the voices of my family that I'd never, ever heard before. Clearly, my mother Renée had been complaining to Martha about what she had to do in Cambridge, because Martha wrote back sympathetically.
It amazes me that they demand so much more from you. I could not do it, to abuse somebody so much.
Actually, do we want to turn the volume up slightly? Thanks. Then, barely 2 weeks after my mother reached England, Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, flew to Munich along with his French counterpart, Monsieur Daladier, to meet with Hitler and his Italian fascist counterpart, Benito Mussolini, in order to agree a deal over Hitler's demands for the Sudetenland. They agreed a deal. Chamberlain flew back triumphantly from Munich. As he walked down the steps of his aeroplane, he held aloft a bit of paper and proclaimed that he'd achieved peace for our time. But clearly he hadn't, because less than 12 months later, Britain and Germany were at war. In fact, just a few days after Hitler and Chamberlain reached a deal, Hitler's troops rolled into the Sudetenland. And if you look at the crowds here, they're cheering, they're waving, some are giving a Nazi salute. I assume these must be the ethnic Germans welcoming in the German army. But not everyone was happy with this, and the letters to my mother are filled with more and more stories about people desperately trying to get away to anywhere they could. Talk about people trying to get to Ecuador, to Brazil, to Hong Kong, and so on. But a lot of people couldn't get away and streamed inland away from Germany. Marta, as she looked out of her flat in Prague, wrote sympathetically about the refugees she saw.
So much misery for those people who have had to leave their homes and work and don't know which way to turn now. The government wants to send them back, but people are refusing to go. Many will face concentration camps there and misery here.
And some people gave way to despair, and this letter was particularly harrowing.
Do you remember little overweight Hans, who followed their Simonina? Imagine, his mother tried to kill herself and the boy with gas in a moment of desperation. The child is dead, but she now has to face the burden of living on, thanks to the wonders of medicine. Isn't that terrible?
But old Grandma Clara just worried about her granddaughter on her own, such a long way away.
Many kisses. Don't worry too much about us. Remember that everything is in God's hands. My dear good child.
And Marta clearly endured many sleepless nights worrying about her daughter, as she wrote.
It is 3 o'clock in the morning. Dawn is near and I can't sleep. It's only me, thinking of you with all my heart. my sweetheart. I would give anything to see you for a couple of hours, to embrace you and to listen to your dear voice.
And then, barely 4 months after Hitler had occupied the Sudetenland, and with no pretext or pretense of an excuse, he occupied the rest of the Czech lands. And now if you look at this footage, you see the crowds. They're not cheering, they're not waving, they're not giving a Nazi salute, except for the German army there, because their country has been occupied by a hostile power. The same night, Martha tried to reassure Renée that everything was okay.
Darling, don't worry, we are all right. We are really upset, but all right. We think of you with all our love, Mama.
And the family turned its attention to helping Ilse, Renée's older sister, get out. And for a while, it looked like that was going to happen. Arrangements were being put in place.
On Friday, Ilse will be informed about when she will be allowed to leave. But who will meet her at the station? He will not have any money on her. She is only allowed to take 10 Reichsmarks with her, but she may have to spend them on the way.
And Ilse herself, who'd been living in England the year before, until her visa ran out and she had to return, wrote excitedly in English,
I feel like forgetting my English, and I like the very expressions. I hope I shall soon have the opportunity of practicing the language. I will really stay in London. I hope you will still be there when I arrive, and I look forward to seeing you very much.
but as Renée's father put it was not that easy. A lot of obstacles.
It should be Ilse's turn quite soon, but there are so many formalities, and as soon as she completes one, the next comes along. It's easy to lose patience with that.
And Renée's Aunt Erna, who was trying to get to England as well at that time, encountered much the same problems.
I thought that I would see you again very soon. But each time I think it's my turn, new rules are introduced, and I have to start all over again.
And I think old Grandma Clara saw it most clearly. It wasn't going to happen.
Before the ills have come as well. But that's not going to happen in the near future.
And the family turned to Renée to see what she could do to help her sister get out. But what could she do? She was 19 at the time. She had no friends or family nearby. She had no money. And that was important because the British government demanded guarantees that each incoming refugee would be sponsored in what would cost in today's money about £5,000, which she didn't have. And in the end, she wasn't able to help her sister get out. And I believe that's one reason why she didn't want to talk about it, that she felt guilty for the rest of her life. And as the family in Prague found, the Germans introduced more restrictions.
The Jewish people here aren't allowed to swim anywhere here now, and one has to go to Strasbourg or elsewhere. I have just come back from the park, and in the main restaurant, one can see big signs now, Jews not allowed, which you must already know from reading the newspapers.
But with happier news, Ilse had now met this young man, Peter Keane, on the left. And clearly the family took to him straight away.
Peter has become a dear friend of ours. He is here all day long and draws and draws.
In the middle, that's a sketch of Grandma Clara. That's an oil painting he made of Ilse. and that of Marta, Renée's mother. And I'm not an art expert, but I think those are pretty impressive works of art, particularly if you consider he was only aged about 20 or 21 at the time when he did those. And they worried about being split up, so they decided to get married in Prague in a little bit of a hurry.
They received a notice that indicated that they might be separated, so their first thought was to get married immediately, as they had already agreed to do so. They strolled around all day on Monday. Peter's course started on Tuesday morning, and he had 21 pupils to look after. So when he returned at 1:45, Ilse said, "Keep those clothes on. We're getting married at 1:00. In double quick time, I ran to the magistrate with her. Ilse called some people on the phone to ask them to be witnesses, but could not get through to your father. He hurried along, but got there too late. Within 15 minutes, Ilse had become Frau Kiel, and they had gained 2 years' son."
And they were right, because not long afterwards, Ilse and Peter were sent to the town of Terezin, or as the Germans called it, Theresienstadt. Now, Terezin is a small town. It's about 40 kilometers north of Prague in the Czech Republic. And living there before the war was some 5,000 or so Czechs. But the Germans ordered them to leave, and instead of that 5,000, sent 50,000 Jews to the town to live in overcrowded, miserable, damp conditions. It was hailed when the Red Cross came to visit as a town for the Jews, but in reality it was no more than a way station, a stopping point on the way to being sent elsewhere. And if you look at this chart, you'll see most of the people sent to Terezin did not survive the war. Old Grandma Clara was sent next in July 1942, but maybe mercifully, she didn't last very long. She died within a week of her arrival. And her son, Renée's uncle Robert, wrote bitterly,
She was 88 years old. Why could she not have died only a few months earlier in her home, surrounded by her daughters?
And then on the 25th of July 1942, Karl and Marta received notice that they were being sent to Terezin the next day. And they wrote what reads to me like a farewell letter to my mother. Marta wrote,
"I will send you our fondest wishes before we depart. We are leaving to meet your grandmother and Ilse in the countryside. Our beloved one, all our heart is with you, and your letters were always our greatest joy. Remain healthy, so that we will all be reunited in joy and health one day. I embrace you with all my love."
while Karl simply added a line.
I am including myself in the greeting.
And that was the last Renée heard from her family until she was studying after the war at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. And she told me once how she walked every day to the post office 5 miles away to see if there was any message, any sign that her family had survived. But she heard nothing until in July she went there and received a telegram which reads, Marta, Karl, Ilse, Peter, 15th October 1944, deported to Oswiecim, since now missed, stop. Oswiecim is a town in Poland that is much better known by the name the Nazis gave it, Auschwitz, where an estimated 1.1 million people were murdered. The vast majority of the people murdered there were Jews, but not only Jews were murdered, Roma and Sinti were murdered. Homosexuals were murdered. Political opponents of the regime were murdered. Anyone, basically, who the regime disapproved of. But my mother did receive, in October 45, a letter from an aunt of hers, Carl's sister, who had survived. The aunt Hedda wrote about conditions then.
There was no way to stop her fate. In autumn 1944, I went to Auschwitz, and so did your parents 3 weeks later. And after a week, also Peter, Lisa, and his parents. As I knew the situation there, I assumed that they were not tortured before they died. Also not Peter, who went with his father, but what happened to Ilse, I don't know.
And Hedda wrote a second time, a day later, about the final days in Terezin.
Martha, which has certainly survived, and was in a good shape when the terrorists came. Wednesday, 1944, autumn transports to Auschwitz began. But none of us knew what was there. Carl was very quiet when he left and was hoping to survive. I went with them to the gate of Terence, and after they had to stay there for 3 days, I went every day with Ilse to bring them food. Paul's last words to me were, I will try to survive. I don't know if they will let me.
And in a letter that I hope my mother never saw, her uncle Robert wrote to his great friend, the artist, Oskar Kokoschka, about what happened to Ilse, her sister.
I just found the news that my niece, Ilse Francis Morton, was rescued and cared for by the Russians. But having still the blessing of her husband and her parents, she could not stand life any longer and committed suicide.
So now let me come back to this young man, Eugene Morgenstern. He and my mother, as teenagers in Czechoslovakia before the war, went to Jewish summer camps, and when Renée came to England, they started writing to each other, and I've seen some of their letters. Now, he was stuck in Czechoslovakia after the Germans had occupied the whole country and was pretty desperate to get out. He decided to make his way to what was then the British Mandate of Palestine, now comprising modern-day Israel, Jordan, and the West Bank. Now, even in those days, there was trouble between Jews and Arabs, and the British, who controlled the territory, decided that the best thing they could do would be to ban further immigration. And to do that, they mounted a naval blockade along the Mediterranean coast. But of course, if you think about it, with people desperate to get out of Europe, that wasn't going to put them off. It just made them far more desperate, and the crossing far more dangerous. So George firstly made his way to Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, on the river Danube, where the Slovak authorities, who were in league with the Germans, arrested and detained him and other would-be travellers. And it wasn't for another 9 months that he was able to continue his journey, when he boarded a ship going down the Danube through various European countries to the port of Tulcea in Romania on the Black Sea. There they boarded a bigger ship, the SS Atlantic, in order to sail to Palestine. It was a terrible journey. There was an outbreak of typhus that killed a number of the passengers. They ran out of food. They ran out of water. Eventually, they ran out of fuel. They went round the ship, getting whatever could be spared, cabins, bunk beds. They even burnt the masts on the ship. But in the end, they were drifting helplessly in the Mediterranean, when, very luckily, they were spotted by a British warship and towed into the nearby harbour of Limassol. There, they were refuelled and, under escort from the British, made their way to Haifa in Israel. But of course, when they got there, they were promptly arrested because they were illegal immigrants. And I don't know if any of you have been to the place, Atlit, just south of Haifa. There's a museum there which shows a number of the crossings that people took, both during the war and after. When they got to Israel, they were put on a bigger ship and taken down to the island of Mauritius, deep in the Indian Ocean, where the British interned them. Now, you may have come across Mauritius, you may even have been there. It's a stop for luxury cruise liners. But in those days, there are no five-star hotels, no restaurants to cook whatever you want. It was a prison camp. And this photograph of the men's quarters bears that out. It looks exactly like a prison. Still, after some 15 months or so, George and a number of the others got out by volunteering to join the Czech forces fighting with the British. And on board a ship steaming to England, he wrote to Renée.
I left Mauritius some weeks ago to join up with the Czech forces, after being in a sort of prison for 15 months. There is much to be said, but I'm leaving it for another time. Only one thing. If you love me still, I'd like to get married as soon as possible. Please, in answering this letter, be quite sincere. Say yes, or no, or not yet.
And I think this photograph tells you what my mother replied. It's one of the stranger wedding proposals I've heard of, but my parents were married in England in 1943. And what happened to George's parents? His father, Jindřich, was sent from his hometown of Brno in southern Czech Republic to Terezin and was subsequently murdered in Auschwitz, while his mother was sent from Brno to Riga in Latvia, where she was murdered. Now, after the war, knowing that their families had not survived, George and Renée wanted to go back to see if anything could be retrieved, family possessions, anything to remember their families by. And George first went to his hometown of Brno, which he didn't find a good experience.
I feel I'm choking now and then. I walk a lot through Brno, and everywhere there are ghosts. They are not dead. They come out of their houses and stare at you with empty eyes, asking questions I dare not answer. It is not as if I were in a strange town. I know everything. I understand the language. It is one of those dreadful nightmares, complete with the immediate sense of unreality, accepted without surprise or fright. I wish, though, the dead were dead. Corpses are easy to cope with. We bury them. But what on earth or in hell do the dead want of me? The bearable parts of the town are those that have changed since I left. If only that horrible familiarity with staircases and houses and street corners would be eliminated. The place is haunted, and I shall be glad to go to Prague on Monday, where there are fewer memories and fewer ghosts. I hope I shall never come back to this country again, once I leave it.
and he moved on to Prague next, where he found much the same.
As for the main purpose of my journey, I'm more and more doubtful how much I will be able to accomplish. In cases where the people are still decent, there is not much bother. Only the decision what to take over, what to sell, and what to give away. So far, I haven't done anything of the kind. I found several pieces of our furniture in Brno, but only very few in good hands. If the person concerned tells you he bought it and refuses to hand it back, there is nothing one can do except embark on a long and mostly hopeless legal action.
And one thing my father said repeatedly before he died,
We knew that life would be bad under the Nazis, but no one could imagine in their wildest nightmares how bad it would be.
and this slide summarizes the numbers of Jews involved in Czechoslovakia. The pre-war population, as I mentioned earlier, was 360,000. Of those, 26,000 immigrated, 70,000 survived in the country, but the vast majority were murdered during the Holocaust. And to finish off, this slide shows the various people I've spoken about. Renée's uncle Robert did manage to get to the US and lived in New York for the rest of his life, where he died in 1952, several months before I was born. Father George ended up living in Switzerland and died there at the age of 80, while my mother lived the rest of her life in Finchley, and she lived long enough to see her children grow up and her grandchildren born. And she told me once how happy she was that they'd taken what she saw as her values and carried them forward. And finally, the reason why I give these talks is given in the words of George Santayana, a philosopher who wrote more than 100 years ago, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Now, if you have any feedback and want to get a form, I suggest you scan the QR code. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much.